So I hope you've had a chance to look at the allegory of the cave. There are lots of little videos about it, so if that one that I put the link up to doesn't work, you can YouTube it and you can find lots of different explanations. The allegory of the cave is important because it gives us a really uh, well, it's on one hand it's simple. It's kind of easy to understand the basics of it. It's terribly complex if you can spend years talking about it and working through it. But it's a simple look at what Plato tried to present, which is that this world of ideas, this world that uh, we mostly ignore and are kind of unaware of, is the real world, and it's the real thing. And what we tend to think is real is not real at all. If you watch the allegory, if you don't want to watch the allegory of the cave, you can go back and get on Netflix or something and watch The Matrix, because The Matrix is a movie built around Plato's allegory of the cave. And if you watch The Matrix and you think about Plato and the allegory of the cave, then you'll see that pretty easily and pretty quickly. Excuse me. In The Matrix, the people live in this world that they think is real, but then at some point, some of them break out of that and they see, oh my goodness, that's not the real world. The real world is something totally different. And then there are this group of people, those weird men in dark suits and sunglasses, who try to keep people from doing that and try to kill people who actually find out the truth. Well, the same thing happens in the allegory of the cave. People are chained in the cave. They look over and they see these shadows on the wall, and that's all they've ever seen and all they've ever known. And so they believe with all of their heart that those shadows are what's real. They think that's reality, that's life, that's our world. And then one of them somehow breaks free from the chains and climbs up out of the cave and sees the sunlight and sees the world outside of the cave. And he's immediately just overwhelmed by this notion that what we've been seeing, what we've been living in, is not true. It's not real. There's something different. And he's just astonished at the sun and the plants and the things that he sees. And he thinks how incredible it is. And then the second thing he thinks is, I've got to go back down and tell those people in the cave about this. So he goes back to the cave and he says, hey, look, I've seen something new and different. I've been outside of this cave and there's something else. These shadows that we're watching, that's not real. What's real is outside. Okay. In the little cartoon that maybe you watched or didn't, for example, you can see the shadow of a duck on the wall. Okay. But then when you go outside, the guy sees a real duck. And he immediately, of course, understands the difference between the shadow image of the duck that he thought was the real thing and now the actual duck. And he goes back in the cave and he explains this to his friends, and the surprise, but of course it's not really a surprise to any of us, is that when he tells them about this new, incredible, wonderful thing, they don't say, great, let's go see the sun. Let's get out of the cave and go see what you're talking about. No, they kill him. They kill him because they don't want to change, because they're comfortable, because they like what they have, because the idea of sitting in the cave and staring at the shadows is more acceptable to them than the adventure, the fear, the novelty of climbing out of the cave and seeing something different. And so they reject the new, they reject the different, they reject this revelation because they like what they have. What they have is more comfortable to them. It's hard and it's uncomfortable and it stretches your mind and it worries you and it bothers you to do something new and different. It's hard. And then for one thing, it's a lot of work. But for another thing, you have to give up some of the things that you've always held on to. And rather than be willing to give up the things that they've always believed are true, they just kill the messenger. And they say, no, we're not going to look outside the cave. Now, my challenge to you is to think about that for a bit and think, okay, Um, when do I do that in my own life? When do we do that as people, for example? Let me give you a really simple, not very deep example. Um, I was talking with some friends the other night, and we were talking about the presidential election. And somebody said, I don't remember who, said something like, well, maybe what will come out of this is that the Republican Party will be kind of split up in several ways. And I said, yeah, and maybe the Democratic Party will be split up in some ways. And who knows, maybe we end up 5 or 6 years from now with 5 or 6 or 7 different parties, or something like that. And this kind of blows up the two-party system. Well, there's an example. We can kind of dream and say, wow, wouldn't it kind of be cool if there was something more than just a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate? And of course, there are a couple more, but they can't get in the game, right? They don't have enough money. They can't get publicity, none of that stuff. They won't be in the debates, for example. So we can kind of think, oh, out there somewhere there might be this wonderful land where there was more than just 2 bad choices. At least some of us might think that. However, destroying the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, kind of blowing those up and creating something new would be really hard. I mean, think about all of the money that would be lost, all of the power that people would lose, all of the control that people would have to give up to get rid of the two-party system. Think about not just the election, but think about the House and the Senate and and those parties all across the states that would have to give up their power, give up their control, give up what we've lived with for 100 years and do something new. And when you think about that for a minute, you think that might be really good for us. But then you have to immediately think, we won't ever do that because it's too hard and because no one will give up power and control and money. And that's what Plato told us with the allegory of the cave. We come up with new and different ideas when we see the light, when we see the truth. Usually people don't flock to us and say, oh, thank you for telling us the truth. Usually they want to kill us. So think about when that has happened in your life. It could be in a group of friends when somebody said, hey, how about this idea? And everybody said, no, we can't do that. That's too good or bad or wrong or right or different or whatever. If you've ever been a part of church, it's probably happened in church because it happens in church all the time. Think about right now. Think about those of you who are Christian. Think about what happens if somebody who tries to present kind of a deconstruction of our church doctrine or theology for the last 300 or 400 or 500 years and says, hey, what if we've been doing this wrong? What if we've been doing something that really wasn't true? What if we've been involved in promoting these ideas that are not really the main ideas? What if that happens in your church? Oh my gosh, people are turned upside down. And pastors don't know what to say, and we don't know what to teach, and we don't know what to do with the scripture, and we're not sure who's in or who's out, or what's right or what's wrong exactly, and it blows everything up. And so even if that was really the truth and really the right thing to do, it's so hard for us to do it. It takes a revolution. It's painful and it's hard. So Plato not only says, hey, here's truth. He says, I understand that we don't like truth. We like to live in the cave. We like to sit and watch the shadows, and we don't like someone telling us that there's something new or different or better. We like to sit in the cave. So think about that. Think about how you can apply that to your experience, to your life. Think about in the future places and situations you'll be in where someone says, hey, I've been out of this cave. and whether or not you'll be able to say, let's go outside the cave and see what it is, or whether you'll be someone who says, I'm not going out, and if you don't stop talking about the cave, we're going to kick you out, because that's what we usually do. Now Plato gives us lots of stuff, but one of the other things he gives us that's a really interesting thing is a look at the soul, and he decides that the soul is 3 parts. And when we talk about these parts, I want you to think about what this maybe sounds like to you. So Plato says that the soul is tripartite. It has 3 parts. And he describes the soul in terms of a chariot, okay, with 2 horses pulling the chariot and a chariot driver. And he says the soul is kind of like this. Now, we could take that word soul and we could replace it with that word psyche, okay, or psyche, a Greek word, and it means a little bit more than what we typically think of as soul. Most of us, when we use the word soul, we think of this spiritual thing that's connected to God or something. And Plato's not really doing that. I mean, that's kind of part of it, but it's also it's a mixture of that and what we would call mind. Okay, so remember that when he talks about the tripartite soul, he's really talking more about what we would think of as the mind than what we would typically think of as the soul. Okay, so if you think about this as being a tripartite mind, psyche, okay, he says there are 2 horses and a driver. The horses are what he calls spirit and appetite. Now, those sound maybe not terribly distinct, but the descriptions are. The spirit horse is a horse that's lively, that has energy, that's powerful, but is also obedient. Does what you tell it to do. Okay? The appetite, the other horse, is also strong and powerful and full of life, but is also really disobedient, unruly, violent, does whatever it wants to do. Will turn the chariot upside down. Okay? So you have these 2 horses, both strong, both powerful, but one's really obedient and does what it's supposed to do. The other one is out of control. And then you have the chariot driver, who he describes as reason. So the chariot driver holds the reins on both the strong, lively, but obedient horse and the strong, unruly, violent horse. And the chariot driver controls those 2 things. Now, if you think of that for just a minute, it's kind of easy to see that Freud's picture of the personality or the mind fits this pretty well. The id, the ego, and the superego. So if we could take this and translate it into Freud, we have the spirit, lively but very obedient, does the right thing. That would be like the ego, maybe. The appetite would be like the id. The chariot driver would be like the superego, reasonable, thoughtful. Okay, you might even tweak it around a little bit, and you could even say maybe that the spirit is the superego. That doesn't fit quite so well, but you might even say that, and that the chariot driver is the ego. You know, because in Freudian theory, we say that the ego has to balance between the superego and the id. Well, we could do that here. The ego, the chariot driver, could be the chariot driver, and then the spirit could be the superego, always doing everything right. The appetite is the id, doing whatever it wants to do. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of looking at this, but it's one of those places where you see things coming together and making some sense that are centuries apart, and it makes you wonder if there are a couple of possibilities. For example, Freud knows Plato and draws from that. The other possibility, though, is that 2 brilliant minds, centuries apart, reach kind of similar conclusions. That's also a possibility, right? Because truth doesn't really change that much. So if Plato thinks, what are people like? And he comes up with these three kind of forces. And then Freud, you know, 2,000 years later, 2,200 years later, says, what are people like? And he comes up with these three distinct kind of forces. It's really kind of an interesting thing. And so it may tell us, wow, this is really true. Um, and it may kind of validate what both of these people are doing. That we have these different parts of ourselves that kind of push us one way or the other. So there's a quick look at Plato. Be sure that you read in your textbook about Plato. Read the chapter on the early Greeks, and you'll read about Plato. And there are several other things there that you need to get. So be sure that you read that chapter pretty thoroughly. Now, if we move from Plato, we get to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle comes along. You can see there the dates, and 427 to 347 BC for Plato. So Plato dies in 347. Aristotle comes along in 384. So they cross over about 30 or 40 years. Okay, so Aristotle grows up in a family that's kind of a middle class kind of family. They're certainly not poor. His father is a court physician, works for the government in a sense, and so steady job, steady income, all of that sort of thing. So Aristotle grows up not terribly privileged, but kind of. He is allowed then, probably because of his status, to attend Plato's academy, Plato's school, and so he's there from the time he's 17 till the time he's 37. So he goes there, he studies, he learns at Plato's academy, and then once he becomes an adult, and we don't know at which point necessarily this exactly happened, he becomes a teacher in Plato's academy. So Aristotle is completely connected to Plato in not quite the same way, but a little bit of the same way that Plato is connected to Socrates. So Aristotle learns at Plato's academy, then teaches there until he's in his late 30s. When he's in his late 30s, he leaves Athens to travel around a bit because he's been in the same spot for 20 years. Well, 37 years probably. But he leaves Athens to travel around, and at some point he gets this job as a tutor to Alexander, who would later on become Alexander the Great. Alexander's father is Philip, and Philip hires Aristotle to tutor Alexander. So he travels with that group around Greece and Macedonia, and he kind of connects with them. He probably makes a decent amount of money. He probably gains a little bit of status. And so at some point he returns to Athens and he establishes his own school, which he calls the Lyceum. So we have Socrates, who trains Plato, probably in kind of an informal kind of a way. And then we have Plato that establishes a school called the Academy, and Aristotle learns there. And then Aristotle, and after he's grown up and traveled around a little bit, founds his own school in Athens called the Lyceum, where he trains people to think also. So we have a pretty significant legacy there of people learning to think and teach. So Aristotle he grows up in Plato's world, but he's he shifts away from Plato. He doesn't deny and this makes sense. He grows up in Plato's world and he learns from Plato. So when he kind of establishes his own way of thinking, he doesn't deny Plato. He doesn't say Plato is wrong about everything, but he shifts his emphasis from the world of ideas or forms to the world of materialistic things and decides, well, the world of forms or ideas is real, okay, but it's not the only thing that's real. So if we go back to my analogy of the cup, I happen to have the same cup here. We could say, well, Plato would say that this is not real. That what's real is the idea or the form of the cup. Okay? But Aristotle would say, yes, the idea of the cup, the form of the cup is real and is eternal and does endure. But this cup that I can touch and see is actually real also. And we shouldn't draw such a division between the thing itself and the idea of the thing, that they're more connected than separate. So that's why we say Aristotle becomes the quintessential realist. Plato's the idealist. Now, again, here's one of those places where idealism, if I say, oh, you're so idealistic, it means you're not living in the real world. For Plato, to be an idealist meant I believe in the world of forms and ideas. It's not a silly thing at all. It's a very serious thing. But Aristotle becomes a realist. Aristotle says these things are real. All of these things that we touch and see are real, and we shouldn't disconnect them so much from the idea or the form. Aristotle is also a mind and body monist, not a dualist. Aristotle believes the mind or the soul, the psyche, is inseparable from the body, that they're one thing, that we shouldn't think about mind and body as two separate entities that are somehow connected. He says they are one thing, they're inseparable. Okay? So, two very distinct ways that he moves from Plato. He believes that stuff is real, and he believes that the mind and body are an inseparable kind of monad, one thing. All right. He also believes that the psyche is a place where ideas are formed. They don't pre-exist. Remember that Socrates and Plato said that basically that the teacher is the midwife to knowledge, that knowledge pre-exists within us, and the job of teaching is to draw that knowledge out, like a midwife births a baby. Well, Aristotle says the psyche, the mind, is a place, and I don't know if he really means a physical place, but he means the psyche is that entity in which ideas are formed. They don't pre-exist. There's not anything there until it's created in the psyche. Okay? Now, these are two very different ways of thinking about a human. Okay? One is we are born with things inside us, with information, with ideas, and the job of the teacher, the job of the process of living and learning pulls that knowledge out of us to where we understand it. Or, as Aristotle says, we're that blank slate, that white sheet of paper, and there's nothing there. The tabula rasa, we call it later on, John Locke. Okay, so the psyche is this place where ideas happen, and there's nothing there pre-existing. The psyche for Aristotle is the process of making this happen. Okay, it's not so much a thing as it is a process. Now, for most of us, that gets closer to what we tend to think. Most people, when we say, what is the mind, we think of it not as a place or thing, but we think of it as the process, the way that we think, the things that our brain maybe does. That's the psyche, that's the mind. Okay? So Aristotle brings us some ideas that are quite a bit different than Socrates and Plato, of course. Now, Aristotle says that the psyche, the mind, has several functions. These things that it does, there are several things here. Okay, and this, of course, is kind of a simplification of thinking about that. So Aristotle says that the functions of the psyche are these: sensation, which is when we gather information from our environment. with our body, basically with our senses. Everything that we see or smell or touch or hear, everything that we experience, sensation. That's the psyche doing that. That's the mind doing that. And then perception, which is what happens with that information. Okay? So the difference in sensation and perception is that the sensation is the foundation or the basis, okay? And then the perception is one of the ways I think about this, and this may not be technically perfect, but one of the ways I think about this is then the perception is kind of what I tell myself about that, okay? So if I taste this coffee, the sensation is what happens when my tongue and my mouth sends information to my brain. Okay? The perception is that coffee's not quite hot enough and it's kind of sweet because I like sugar in my coffee. So the perception is that coffee needs to be hotter and that coffee's sweet. But that's not the sensation. The sensation is what happened with my tongue sending information to my brain. So Aristotle says that the psyche functions that way. Those are two things. It does the sensation, and then it does the perception. Okay. Now, the third thing that the psyche does is it has imagination. Now, here's a kind of an important way to think about this word. When you say imagination, or I say imagination, we're usually talking about something that we think of as being very creative and kind of unique, right? This use of the word doesn't really mean that you created something new, that you did something where we all go, whoa, that's really cool. You have such a great imagination. This word, it just means the imagination that everyone has. Now, what that means is that I can concoct something in my head based on my memory. Okay? And that thing that I can put together in my head may be wild and crazy, or it may be just very normal. So, two examples of maybe what this means. What we would think of as imagination might be if I think, okay, I've seen a zebra before, okay, but the zebra that I've seen was black and white. Now, I've also seen lots of other colors. I've seen purple and yellow, for example. So, based on my memory of purple, my memory of yellow, and my memory of zebra, I can create something in my mind that's a zebra with purple and yellow stripes. Okay? And if I drew a zebra, painted a zebra on my wall that has purple and yellow stripes, someone might say, oh, you used your imagination. Okay? However, other things that are much simpler and much more common are also our imagination. So if I think on my way home today, I need to go by Bible Hardware and pick up a little faucet to hook my refrigerator's ice maker up. Okay? I really actually have to do that. So I'm going to go by Bible Hardware. So what I have to do is I think, okay, I've been to Bible Hardware before, and I know that I'm going to drive down Pine, and then I'm going to turn left at some point and go over to, I can't remember what that next street is, and that's where Bible Hardware is. I also remember that I looked at that faucet and I said, okay, this is a half-inch faucet and it's got a quarter-inch thing on it for the refrigerator to hook to. Those are things that are in my memory. So I'm making a plan based on my memory. Now, that's imagination because that hasn't happened yet. It will happen in the future. It's something I'm going to do, and it's something that I have to kind of conjure up in my mind. And I do that based on pulling memories out of what's happened to me before. Okay? So our imagination here, according to Aristotle, is both that creative, wild thing that Disney does, And it's also just me making a plan to go get a part for my refrigerator.